Most folks call me Freddie. I am 36 years old and for the last 17 years, I have worked in the same paint and body shop owned by the man that taught me how to do this job. I won't get into much detail, but my shop does mostly high-end work. If we have a bay open and you bring in a car that has been involved in a crash, we will accept it most of the time. The way our shop is set up though, we lose money on those types of jobs. To give you an idea, I just finished with a car worth over $200,000. So while not attempting to brag, I am doing okay. I drive an old 1975 Chevy C10 pickup. I restored. My story is not about my job. It is about my now ex-wife, Julia. I was born in a small town in eastern North Carolina to a now retired Marine and a school teacher. I spent almost all my early years across the world. My folks settled down in Maryland and I live and work about 2 hours away. Julia was in my senior class when we were in California, and she was the daughter of an insurance salesman and an executive assistant to a local politician. They did well. Julia was born in California. Her father wanted me to go to college and come to work for him in his business. I knew years before this is what I wanted to do. Camp Pendleton was my dad's last duty station before his retirement. He retired about 4 months after I graduated from high school. I remember having dinner at Julia's home and her father really was on to me to go to college. I knew my father was going to retire soon and was going to Maryland. I knew there was nothing for me in California. So over the next few weeks, I broke up with Julia. I then packed up and moved with my folks to Maryland, with both of my baby sisters. When we got to Maryland, I started working in a local Walmart doing overnight stocking and was miserable. I then decided to start taking some classes at a nearby trade school and paint and body work. It was there that I met my now boss. He made me an offer. I quit that program and moved to where his shop was. He then taught me this trade. I had a small room in an overhead loft, and while it was not a luxury apartment, it met my need. Then on the weekends I went back to Maryland. About 2 years later, I ran into Julia sitting in a local restaurant and was surprised to see her. I must admit she and I had been exchanging emails over those years. I never thought she would leave California. She somehow found a job and shared an apartment with several other girls. When I look back at this, I know I missed some red flags. Julia never told me what she was going to do. I was taking things slow with Julia because my boss wanted 100% of my mind on that job. I remember I was getting a Porsche ready for painting. When my boss called me into his office, I had a phone call. It was Julia's father. He was furious because Julia had left California and was chasing after me. I took several minutes of abuse from him before my boss got on the other line and told him to shut up, and both of us hung up the phones after this happened. My boss told me to stay away from Julia. My boss is married to a great lady who can bake and brings baked goods to the shop. He had a bad marriage that was so bad. He almost did not get married again. He did. But his wife now is good people. I wished I had listened to him. I had been saving my money, and over the years I had been working, I got several raises. I was saving most of my pay. I then decided to get an apartment in the same city where my shop was. I also asked Julia to marry me and move in with me. We did. We got married and Julia started the application process with a large domestic airline to become a flight attendant. She got finished and started flying within 6 months with her pay as well as mine. We did okay. In fact, we moved to a nicer apartment. All was well. Julia sometimes works flights back home and would visit her folks. Well, that was what I first thought when you start to think about all the classic red flags. Julia was not throwing any that I caught. My life started to come undone. One day when I needed to talk to Julia, she was working a flight to LAX Los Angeles and was going to rent a car and drive to see her parents at that time. They lived almost halfway between Los Angeles and San Diego. By this time, Julia had been on the ground almost 6 hours. I called my in-laws and asked to speak to her. Her mom answered and I noticed her voice changed after I asked to talk to her daughter. At first, she said Julia was not there, but then a few seconds later said she was not there at that time and would have her return my call when she got back home. Julia had a cell phone. The problem is it was not what we all use today. It was a flip phone. And to be honest, the service was not all that great. So I tried the number. I got her voice greeting and left a message. I went to bed that night. Angry, Julia had a 2-day layover and I kept expecting her to call me on my job. She never did. So I called back to her folks' home and said I had not heard anything. Her mom said she was not there at the moment but would have her call me. Something inside me snapped. I told her mom to tell Julia she had exactly 1 hour to call me or her things will be out in the front of our apartment building. I screamed 1 hour and hung up. The only thing I can figure out is her mom knew where she was and called her. It took about 15 minutes and she called the shop. I asked my boss to tell her I now did not want to speak to her and was going to be moving back to the old loft department. I used that evening to pack up most of my belongings into storage and I moved back into that loft. That next day Julia showed up at the shop when she started in. I said both her and her mom are liars and I want nothing more to do with either of them. My boss asked her to leave later. He gave me a piece of paper with his old attorney's information on it. He just smiled and said, "Freddie, keep it handy. Work on the marriage. But if it can't be saved, call him." I should also add several days before Junior left for California was the last time we had sex. This fact will become important later. That next day was a Saturday. So I went back to the apartment and Julia made some breakfast and we talked. I asked her, "Where were you at? And don't tell me you were with your folks." Julia cried some as she told me she missed home and some of her friends there. She had met up with some and they spent time on the beach. Julia went on to say she was sorry. She asked me to come back home. I asked her, "Were you with Gail?" She said, "Yes, I was." I said, "Okay, do not leave my sight. Give me her phone number. I want to call her." All the color had left Julia's face. She also refused to give me her number. I then went into the bedroom and got the last of my things. I told Julia there were about 5 months left on the lease. I would pay my part but would not sign another one. You have that long to decide what you want to do. I also told her I want to make this separation form and plan to hire an attorney to do so by this time. Julia was begging me to call Gail. I figured Gail would find a way to cover for her. So I knew that was a dead end. Julia grabbed me as I was attempting to leave the apartment. I was raised to never hit a woman. I knew my dad would disown me if I did still. I was so angry at Julia. By that time, I told her as plainly as I could. "If you don't let me go, I will break your jaw." She did and fell to the floor crying. By that time, I had all my things out of the apartment that I wanted later. I was in Maryland and told my folks what was happening. My dad asked me to come take a walk with him. My dad was a retired Marine gunny sergeant, tough as nails. He did not put up with any BS and told me as much as we walked. I told him my story and he played devil's advocate and asked me questions. I guess we were out walking for close to an hour as we walked back into the yard. He says something is not right with Julia. "I hate to see your marriage in, but I do support your decision." And he said he was in a position to come up with a few grand to hire a private investigator and an attorney. I took him up on that offer. I did not hire a private investigator but I did hire a local attorney and simply was asking for a no-fault divorce. Julia refused to hire an attorney and would not sign the papers. We had no children and no property. There was nothing to fight over. Julia made more than I did. At that time, I was just wanting out. I lost what I thought was my love for Julia. I did not have a smoking gun, but inside I knew something was off. Julia kept telling my attorney she wanted to get marriage counseling. I said no. So after 4 months went by, I told my attorney to file for a no-fault divorce. It took about another 2 months to get a hearing date. All the while I am doing everything I can do to get Julia to sign the papers. I lost track of the last day. I physically saw Julia before that hearing. All I can say is when she entered that courthouse, she was showing a baby boom. Remember, it has been over 6 months since we last slept together. Julia told me she was 5 months alone. I'm not a college graduate like her father, but I do know, according to the math, there was no way that child was mine. Still at the hearing, Julia told the judge, I was the only man she had ever been with. The judge continued the case after my attorney said I disputed parentage. This was after both of us agreed to do so. The judge did order a paternity DNA test to be done. I saw the look on Julia's face as she walked out. By this time the apartment lease was over and Julia moved back to California. She had her daughter, and by the time of the new hearing, the DNA test results were back. The judge granted the divorce and did not award any support. I understand Julia did add my name to her daughter's birth certificate. But later California removed it. Several years passed. By this time, I was making a percentage of the cars I worked on. I wasn't making a bit over $115,000 a year. It was about this time I found that old Chevy C10. I rebuilt. I spent hours each night working on it. One day, Julia drove up in the yard and wanted to speak to me. She was still in her flight attendant uniform and had worked a flight into one of the airports into D.C. She wanted to show me some photos of her daughter. I said I was not interested in seeing photos of a child that was not mine. Julia's eyes went sad. She then offered to buy my lunch. I again refused. Freddie, I just want to talk. I told her there was nothing to talk about. That baby is not mine. You were cheating on me. So what else was there to talk about? Why? Maybe, Julia, I don't want to know why. I just want you out of my life. Julia rolled up the window of a rented car and drove off. Over the next 4 or 5 years, Julia continued to make contact, seeking to speak to me. Then finally, she came by with that daughter and they mixed-race boy that looked to be about 3. Maybe I walked out and Julia got out of the car and we spoke. I don't know why, but I guess Julia basically wore me down. She told me that day in California, she was in fact meeting her AP and her mom did know about it. In fact, it was her mother that introduced him to each other. He was some kind of pretty boy that had rich parents. They did the deed and she felt bad afterwards. She had no idea I would attempt to call her parents. I told her, Julia, at that time, you were my wife. I needed to contact you about a purchase I was thinking we needed to make. After 2 days I just snapped. Then I pointed to the boy and said, I guess his dad is another pretty boy. Julia said, no, his dad is one of the pilots at her airline that she is living with. By this time, my boss had figured out who it was and had called the police. A cop drove up behind Julia's car and told her that she was being trespassed, and if she came back on the property would be arrested. Julia wanted to hug me. I looked at her and said, no, Julia, I might catch something. Julia was crying when she got into her car. Her last words to me were, Freddie, I will always love you. I turned and walked back into the shop. I went to the office and poured a cup of coffee. I then walked back into the shop and as I sipped on the coffee started thinking about that poor simp. She is living with how he will one day come to regret having a child with Julia.